I remember being in New York. I have a tia, my aunt. My uncle has was in New York for years and years. My dad's brother, and he had married a woman from the Dominican Republic. And I just remember being there at some point, visiting them, visiting New York, and she was talking about the sugar fields and the Dominican Republic. She was talking about some of the memories as a girl, being there, remembering that when she visited. And then there was this offhand comment about the time the American, and this was at the turn of the 20th century, so before her time, but it was sort of the legacy memory when the American Marines went to the Dominican Republic. And it was a type of, the turn of the century, early 20th century, and they had done that at the behest of corporate business interests and agriculture. And this is for those listeners who might be Latin America, it's almost like secondhand story of like whenever the United States has had really concentrated business interest or Cold War interest in Latin America, the military comes in one way or another, whether the military is like training right-wing militias like in Chile or Argentina, or whether the American Marines come themselves, which is what happened in the Dominican Republic. And I remember talking to my aunt, and then years later, it was just a cold, very cold winter, Chicago classic. You have your like parka, you're like barreling through the wind tunnel of like, Fullerton Avenue, where I was living at the time. And I don't know, that idea, my sort of like my aunt's story sort of came to me, and I must have started the Lost Book maybe like the next morning. I was just sort of thinking about the ways in which sort of the American military just sort of has always shown up in Latin America. And it felt to some degree otherworldly. It's almost like a science fiction invasion. And I was like, of course, Adana Moreau has to be sort of like a disappeared or unknown science fiction writer, because that experience of, the Dominican Republic, much like Ecuador at the time, is very agricultural, right? It exports. My own abuelito, my own grandfather in Ecuador, is a farmer. He actually passed 2 years ago at the age of 103. So I was able to really get to know him. He was a labor organizer, a farmer, just this fantastic man. And so I also grew up stories with sort of like, as my dad grew up in this small village, like what was it like to sort of like grow up in the mountains of Ecuador or the sugar canes in the fields of the Dominican Republic? And then what is it like when the most powerful military in the world decides to show up? And it doesn't make any sense if you're a kid. And, you know, so I think some of the story, I think the story of Adana Moreau started from that. And it kind of morphed into just my lifelong love of science fiction. And, I'm sure you've heard this with other guests, like growing up with science fiction. No one ever told me South American writers. No one ever told me like the Latin American science, the wealth of like Chicano and Latin American science fiction writers. So it just made sense to me, I think, that she would be a science fiction writer as an adult and kind of come to terms with what, colonialization could mean for a kid. I had this whole draft of the book where it was just like she was a science fiction writer. I had never gone into sort of the detail in the published form of like what she was writing about. There were like small references and things like that. This happens with any art form. My wife is a sculpture artist, and so I get to watch her put together assemblages and figure out how things fit together. And so there's always a point in which there's always a point in which you really have to like shut up and listen to the material and have fun. And I had reached a point in writing the novel where I just wasn't having fun. And, I had reread some Borges, who I always try to go back to and reread. And I was like, I'm an atheist. I don't believe there's a heaven. I am never going to get to write all the books I want to write. That's, it's that classic Twilight Zone. You can't read all the books that you want to read. And I was like, but I could sure as hell have some fun summarizing the books that I would want to write and never will. And I really like it was a way for me to jump back into the story. And in some ways, it was like a key. It was like a really fun key to be like, well, if I do it once, I have to do it 20 times. Like I have to like summarize. And for me, one of the funnest parts of writing the book was sort of like creating that fictional library, that fiction, the fictional library. Um, and it was truly one, I think it was a way back into the book where I could find myself not only writing a love letter to science fiction, but like having fun as a writer again. Now, flash forward a number of years, and I'll occasionally get these really great emails like, when is when is the lost? When's it going to come out? When are you going to write the science fiction version? I was always curious in the sort of literary mystery of like her, in early in the book she destroys the sequel. Her son reads it, and so the only living memory of it, I'm not giving away too much, but the only living memory of it is sort of like the story that's in her son's head. And for me, I understood after it was written, it became a marker of how like most of the literature in our lives has nothing to do with books, right? Most of it is, again, Vox Humana, it's oral storytelling. Um, I tell my students all the time, and it's true for me that my first experience with literature was at the dinner table. I mean, my dad is just a fantastic storyteller. He's funny. Um, if you have the pleasure of sitting around with a lot of Ecuadorians, whether they're visiting, like jokes can go 45 minutes and everybody contributes to the joke. And so just the idea of like how I understood stories from an early age was just from a lot of that oral tradition and oral storytelling. So it made sense for me that for if there were going to be like a lost manuscript, that maybe it could survive as like an oral story that was then told to others. And for me, it was sort of a revelation like after I had written it. Like after I had written it, I'd be like, oh, it is the oral tradition. And that's how I always experienced. I think I pulled a lot from like my theater days. It was really fun to write something that wasn't so good and then give it to like brilliant actors. Chicago's a big theater town too. And so it's really easy when you're like a young writer in your 20s to be like, I want to write something, but I have no idea what. And then like everyone is like moths to each other in your 20s. You're like, let's put on plays, let's have a theater company. You can't throw a rock without it sometimes. But I think that experience of having written some okay, decent, good, and bad stuff all together, theater, you just keep going and you produce a lot. But then having actors take that on stage and what's really beautiful about the Chicago scene too is like, I grew up in Chicago working class, and again, it's not theater through academia. It's working class kids just trying to put up something that's funny. Coming from not only just Chicago, but you get a lot of kids from New York and LA and the Midwest, and everyone trains here, and then they kind of go to LA, or increasingly LA more than New York right now. But what happens is it's just having that live experience of listening to dialogue, I think has always informed the way I write. And in class when I teach, I'll sometimes refer to it as like the physics of characters, meaning when you get really trapped in how people sound and behave, like try just to imagine them on stage together, and the way their body, the physics of character, like physics is a fantastic metaphor because if you have one molecule next to another, they're going to behave a certain way. And you pull out one molecule and you introduce another, and both of them are going to change their behavior pretty sizably. And I think about that. If you have a father and son arguing on stage, don't have them talk. And I'll talk to my students about this. How do they move about the stage? And can you go back and edit your own work, your own fiction to include that tension? Or like, I don't need a swear, I don't need a slap. How are they just fixed on each other? You pull out the dad and introduce the sister who's been there for him the whole time. And how does the first character, how does their body change? Like it's all these like almost acting 101 scenarios that I think could be really, that have, I think are really helpful in like a fiction workshop class because I think it can pull back and you can really start to sort of like feel people. And again, this is so cliche. And I'm always dating myself with my students, but I'm like, you're in Chicago. You have to go meet people. You have to talk to people. There, 1,000 Instagram or TikTok exchanges is not going to simulate getting into a political argument in a bar in Ukraine Village. It's just not. And so go do that.
No, that's fascinating. As a professor teaching, any other elements of character development that you have recommendations based on your own success with?
Yeah, yeah. I think one thing I always try to do is meet the students as far as what they are. I use this whole method called the Socratic method and feminist process in teaching, which is sort of less about corrective, less about trying to make fixes in any student's work, and more just trying to figure out what material the students are interested in. Like fundamentally, that's one of the hardest things, as a writer, Jake, one of the hardest things as a writer is like, what's the material am I gonna be obsessed about for the next 5 years of my life, right? Like what? And so I think helping them find that material is something that I'm always trying really hard to do as a professor. And then fundamentally, just like I did with high school students, I want to try and feed them as much weird shit as I can, as many independent and translated books as possible, to get away from sort of the commodification of story. And we do live in the United States, and for people who want to publish and stuff, there is an awareness of what is publishing. The weird thing about literature, and I'm sure you hear this all the time, the weird thing about books is like anything that's hot right now, anything that's by the time you're done, is going to be moved on. We're a society that can't focus on an hour of news, let alone 4 or 5 years. And so I try to reframe for my students, you have to find that the material that makes sense to you as an artist. The thing that is not going to only like concern you for the next 5 years, but the next 20. Like who are you as an artist? And it's a little bit of an old school approach, but I think with students, it can be really helpful when they find the thing that really gets them going or interests them. And then you can take a step back from like the commodification of books a little bit and, really just figure out who they are as artists. That's a lifelong process. And I try as a professor to just help just a tiny bit with that process. And Jake, I find that when they find that thing, the writing it just skyrockets. It's the thing that matters to them, and the writing, they find themselves